Today I would like to introduce to you Captain Reverend S.J. Davies, who at present is serving as chaplain to the Royal Irish Hussars stationed in northern Germany. During the Korean War, Captain Davies served with the Gloucestershire Regiment, and during the Battle of the Imjim River was taken prisoner because he preferred to stay with the wounded instead of being repatriated to the rear of the battle zone. As a prisoner of war, he was held by the Chinese Communists for over 2.5 years, and today he is going to give you some of his experiences as a prisoner of war. Captain Davies.
Gentlemen, it's a great honor to be invited to come here and talk to you this morning, and I do appreciate the invitation very much. I'd like to begin by telling you what is that for 2.5 years I was held prisoner of war by the Chinese communists in North Korea. I was captured at the conclusion of the Battle of the Imjin River in April 1951. That battle was fought to prevent the Chinese Communist forces sweeping down the peninsula of Korea and investing the capital city of Seoul by May the 1st, Labor Day, and indeed to prevent them from capturing the whole peninsula and casting the United Nations forces into the sea. Now you know that one of the battalions which played a very big and heroic part in preventing the success of that Chinese operation was the 1st Battalion of the Gloucestershire Regiment, and by that they earned their title of the Glorious Gloucesters. The battle went on from Sunday, April the 22nd to Wednesday, April the 25th, 1951. I haven't got time this morning, gentlemen, to give you some impression of that battle. Simply tell you that it was at the conclusion of that great battle that I was taken prisoner along with the battalion doctor, and thereupon began the experience of 2.5 years as a prisoner of war in Chinese communist hands. Well, now, I learned a lot. I don't know whether the Chinese learned anything from me, but I certainly learned a lot from them. And I think it's important that I should be given the opportunity from time to time of passing on to people like you who are enlisted on behalf of the cause of man's freedom, that I should be able to give to you some impression of the kind of treatment you might expect if you were so unfortunate within the next few years as to fall into the hands of communist captors in some kind of localized war similar to the campaign that was fought by United Nations in Korea. I will spend a few moments, gentlemen, in giving you some impressions of the first hours of capture and try to give you an impression of the general atmosphere of the first interrogation that one underwent as a prisoner. I was interrogated personally for the first time on the second night of capture, and I was taken down into an underground cave, and the chief Chinese interrogator, who spoke no English, was sitting, squatting Oriental fashion, in front of me behind a very low table. The only light in that cave was the light given by 2 flickering candles, but I was forced to squat down in front of the chief interrogator, and behind me in the cave, behind me in the shadows and unseen by me really face to face, were the interpreters. Now that's rather a devastating experience. I hope you don't have to undergo it. But there are you sitting facing a man speaking to you in Chinese, and from behind your back, unseen by you, come the questions of the interpreters. I found it terribly difficult to try to prove to them that I was a chaplain, that I had no military or combatant function, but that my function was purely one of religious leadership in the armed forces. They were not prepared to accept that. And it took me a long time, months in fact, to convince them that I had no military or political function as such, but purely was a chaplain. However, that's not of very great interest to you who are not chaplains. But that gives you the atmosphere of this first interrogation, and I would like to tell you how the Chinese tried to find out what my function was. And they would probably, if you fell into the hands of Chinese captors, employ the same methods today. They will probably give to you a long card, and on that card are printed in English with the Chinese equivalents a whole list of army ranks and functions. It begins with some very exalted rank like Field Marshal with the Chinese equivalent opposite. And so it comes down Major, Captain, then what part of the forces you're in, Air Force, Engineers, Artillery, all the rest of it. Well, now the Chinese they asked me rather, to run my finger down that list and to put my finger on my own rank and function. But I went down the list, and there was captain, but nowhere did the word chaplain appear, so it was very difficult. But that may well be the type of original query you might get as to what your function and rank in the army is. Of course, you know that by the Geneva Convention we are allowed to declare our military number and our rank. It's a very different matter as to how far you can go in declaring what your function is. Obviously, if you were a wise man, you would not declare to your interrogators what your real function is, if in fact it is a vital and important one. In the very early stages of this first interrogation with the Chinese, the question of the Geneva Convention came up. I said, through the interpreters, I will give to you, as I am allowed to do by the Geneva Convention, my correct name, my true military number, and my rank, and I will tell you that my function is that of a chaplain. And the interpreter said, that is not enough. There are many more questions that we have to ask you. You must answer. If you do not answer these questions, we have the right to punish you. And I replied to them, but you cannot do this because of the Geneva Convention. I actually produced my little Geneva Convention card, which I had with me. Now that was greeted by the Chinese with the utmost contempt, and I'd like to make that point, gentlemen, right away at the beginning of this talk. We are brought up to believe that if we fall into the hands of enemy captors, we can play along the line of the Geneva Convention. I'd like to think that that was so. But the brutal truth is that if you fall into the hands of communist captors, you can reconcile yourself to the idea from the word go that they are not going to abide by the Geneva Convention at all, except insofar as it may occasionally serve their ulterior purposes. So you will go into captivity possibly with the idea, well, I've got my Geneva Convention behind me. But I will tell you the brutal truth, that it's not going to avail you very much, if anything at all. The communists will tell you, if you quarrel with them about that, that we do not obey the Geneva Convention because it is an outworn instrument of bourgeois, capitalistic, Western imperialist idealism, or some such nonsense like that. And if you say, well, by what law do you administer your prisoners of war, they will hurl at you the nebulous and question-begging phrase, international humanitarian law, whatever that may be. So that's the first big point I'd like to make. You can get out of your mind, gentlemen, I'm afraid you'll have to, the idea that the Geneva Convention is going to be of much use to you, because it isn't. I'm sorry to say that, but that's the truth. The next big thing I want you to get hold of is this. If you fall into the hands of communist captors, whether they're Chinese or any other type of communist power, you can be sure of one thing, that from the moment of capture, your communist captors will make the underlying assumption that you are a man who needs radical, and I quote their phrase here, re-education in political consciousness. You are a person who stands vitally in need of enlightenment, thought reform, and that your capture, or, as they will say, your surrender, implies that you have a nascent sympathy within you with communist aims. Now, I'd like to make that point crystal clear, especially if you fall into the hands of Chinese communist captors, but I should say that this would also be true of any kind of communist captors. Your captors from the moment of your capture, or as they will prefer to say, your surrender, will make the assumption that you have a nascent sympathy with communist aims. Their function now is to give you the benefit of enlightenment and political re-education. Call it thought reform, brainwashing, as we call it in the West. And now I want to tell you what the communist lenient policy towards prisoners of war really is. Now, gentlemen, this phrase, the lenient policy, is not a phrase that I've invented for your edification this morning. It is the authentic Chinese communist phrase which was given to me. And I have been forced to attend, as a prisoner, a number of lectures given in Chinese and then interpreted into English on this very thing, the lenient policy. Therefore, I would ask you to remember that I do know what I'm talking about here, and that I am not making up any phraseology or inventing anything on my own behalf. What is the lenient policy? I hadn't been a prisoner very long before Commander Ding, who was the supreme Chinese commander of the Officers' Prisoner of War Camp, number 2, in North Korea on the banks of the Yalu River. Incidentally, we called him Snake Eyes. It wasn't long before Snake Eyes gave us one of his famous lectures on the lenient policy. And gentlemen, I will now present to you the dogmatic basis of this lenient policy which the communists adopt towards prisoners of war. Here it is. The world today is divided into two great camps. On the one hand, we have the backward-looking, reactionary camp of the imperialist West, dominated by Wall Street and the City of London. The imperialists, the reactionaries, the warmongers. On the other hand, we have the forward-looking, progressive camp of the peace-loving peoples of the world, led by our beloved comrade Stalin. He was then in favor, remember. A camp which looks for leadership to Moscow, the camp which is determined to bring about world peace and bring to fruition the great aim of the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is the great progressive, peace-loving camp of the world. You men who've been taken prisoners are men from the reactionary warmongering camp. Therefore, you are the enemies of the people. We should kill you. We have every right to kill you because you are the enemies of the people, fighting for the imperialists and the reactionaries. But we are not going to kill you. We should do, but we have a lenient policy. This lenient policy of ours will keep you alive. We shall feed you. We shall give you clothes. We might even give you medical attention. Some of you who learn quickly, we might even send home. This is our lenient policy. We are going to give to you a magnificent opportunity. We are going to teach you, re-educate you. We're going to indoctrinate you in the teachings of Marxism-Leninism, and we believe that after some months of our teaching, you will, of your own free will, leave. You will want to leave this camp of the imperialist warmongers and come over and join the camp of the peace-loving peoples of the world. We believe that your conscience will impel you to do this. And when you have learnt the principles of Marxism-Leninism, when you have seen the great benefits that communism brings to the downtrodden people of the world, when you have thoroughly learned all these things, and this is a great opportunity which will never come your way again, then the time may come when you will be able to return to your homes, and you will return to your homes as bearers of this great new liberating doctrine of the peace-loving people. You will return to your families, your schools, your churches, your villages, your towns, your factories, your armed forces even. You will return bearing with you a seed which you will plant, perhaps in a small group, maybe small, but it is important. When you return to your countries, you will be acting as heralds or apostles or agents of this great new gospel of Marxism-Leninism. this force which will liberate the peoples of the world from the toils of Western imperialist capitalism. That, gentlemen, is the lenient policy. And that explains to you why in this Chinese prisoner of war camp in which I lived for over 2 years, our days were really days of prolonged study. It was a kind of nightmarish school of political indoctrination. Believe me, from time to time we were addressed by the Chinese not as prisoners of war, but as fellow students. The interpreter might begin, "Fellow students, today we will discuss." We were fellow students with them of the principles of dialectical materialism and of Marxism-Leninism. I might add that I was present on one occasion when a high-ranking English-speaking Chinese general came down to visit our camp. All the prisoners were placed in the lecture room, and he began his talk to us in this way. "Liberated officers and warrant officers of the British and American armies." There it is, liberated. He began his talk to us in that way. We were actually liberated. Capture, or surrender as they said, had taken us out of the warmongering camp and liberated us into this great progressive camp of the peace-loving peoples of the world. Now, gentlemen, I'm going to give you a few impressions of the camp number 2, in which so many British and American officers lived, up on the banks of the Yalu River in North Korea. First of all, I will give you for a moment or two some idea of its physical appearance, and then I will give you a typical day in that camp, the sort of day, gentlemen, that you may expect if ever you have the misfortune, which God forbid, to fall into the hands of communist captors. The camp itself was about 110 yards long by about 80 yards wide, set in a great natural bowl between towering mountains which in the winter were covered with snow. In this valley, in this great natural hollow, there was the tiny Korean hamlet of Pingchong-ni, in which life really hadn't moved forward in the last 2,000 years. I would say that methods of agriculture and so forth were on a par with those in biblical times. In this village, the Japanese, when Korea had been a part of the Japanese Empire, constructed a long one-story Korean schoolhouse. Corrugated iron roof, clay and wattle walls, wooden floorboards. The Chinese took this schoolhouse with its compound, the size of which I've told you, over, and they made that into prisoner of war camp number 2. They divided the long schoolhouse up into partitions, and in these partitions about 24 officers slept and ate and had their being. It was a very cramped existence. One just slept at night on rice sacks spread on the floor, shoulder to shoulder, rather like sardines in a tin. At the end of this long Korean schoolhouse, there was a much bigger room, which was the camp lecture room. And I don't think I need to tell you now the sort of lectures that went on in that lecture room. Well, now, here was a typical day. Let's imagine the time was January 1952 in North Korea. The temperature, the average temperature, is about 30 degrees below zero. Some of you have fought in Korea, probably, and know the terrible Korean winter temperatures. The prisoners were aroused at 6:30 in the morning, kicked and shaken up by the guards from their miserable dens, and forced to go out onto the parade ground before 7 o'clock. Now, that was one of the most ghastly experiences I've had. One was unbelievably cold. It was as though your ears and nose and fingers were being pressed between strong vices, and you stood there for 10 minutes of Chinese roll call in the twilight of this bitter January dawn. Incidentally, as we walked down the steps from the Korean schoolhouse, which was erected along a long bund of earth, the Chinese invariably, from the squawk boxes up in the trees around the camp, would play Soviet and Chinese revolutionary music. I'd like to tell you, gentlemen, that morning after morning after morning, one of the recordings they played over that for us was a recording of Paul Robeson singing one of the great communist songs, Arise, ye prisoners of starvation, arise, ye wretched of the earth. I thought, what an ironic sort of choice that the Chinese had made to make that as our morning theme song. And after that, you'd get the red flag and the Internationale and so forth. After roll call, there'd be a short period of calisthenics, a most pitiful sight to see these half-starved, scraggy, filthy, bearded men trying to do a few pitiful stretching exercises at the command of the Chinese. And after that, we went back into our squad rooms, not for breakfast, gentlemen. Don't think of that for a moment, not for breakfast, but for the first period of communist indoctrination for the day. This took the form of group reading by one of the monitors appointed by the Chinese. In each squad, the Chinese appointed a man as prefect of studies or monitor. Very often, they chose a man whom they had come to know from experience was a rather weak character, the sort of chap who under fairly light pressure would talk. And this man had to read from a book which would be issued by the Chinese to the squad. Each squad was studying a different book. Now, oddly enough, the book that was being read in my group at this time of the morning for several weeks was a publication which came out in Great Britain, a communist publication published by the British Communist Party. And what I am going to tell you now illustrates in a remarkable way the international nature of this great conspiracy against man's freedom that we call communism. The book was called The British Road to Socialism, with a foreword by Mr. Harry Pollitt, the chairman of the British Communist Party, and this book was being read to me for several weeks for this first study period of the day in this prison camp in North Korea, 11,000 miles away from London, was being read to me day after day by an American officer from Texas. Now that's an extraordinary fact. Here am I, 11,000 miles away from London in a North Korean prison camp, and a publication of the British Communist Party London is being read to me by an American officer at the command of the Chinese. After this first period of group reading, then came breakfast, and breakfast was a very pitiful affair. A couple of bowls of rice, followed by a bowl of potato or cabbage soup, whichever was in season at the time. And that was it. At 10 o'clock, the bell rang, summoning all the prisoners to the big camp lecture room. And there we would be forced to squat over 300 British and American officers and warrant officers. We would be forced to squat on the ground, Oriental fashion, sitting on the floorboards, while the Chinese political commissar, a wretched little man called Comrade Sun from the People's University of Peking, lectured us on the evils of life under Western capitalist imperialism and the advantages of life as it was lived under the Soviet rule. One learned some incredible things in those lectures. One learned, for instance, that in Great Britain only 5% of the children are allowed free education, which of course is an absolute lie. One of the funniest things that came out in these lectures, which were often naive and amusing, was this. Sun was saying to us one day, in the West, your government do not want the young people to study hard and learn the truth. They do not want your young people to become politically self-conscious, because they know that if they do, they would rise and throw off the yoke of imperialistic capitalism. But your governments are not interested in that. They would far prefer to have your young people wasting their time, going to dances in the evening, frittering away their spare time, attending all sorts of stupid and warmongering plays. He said, as a matter of fact, we have information at the moment that in London at this very time, our observers in London, just think how sinister that sounds, gentlemen, tell us that there's a play running to which hundreds of thousands of your young people are going. It's a warmongering play of the worst chauvinistic imperialist type. We waited to hear the title of the play. The play is called Annie, Get Your Gun. Gentlemen, That is not a story which I have invented for your amusement. It actually happened, and the reaction of the officers listening to Comrade Sun was exactly the reaction that you have expressed in these last few seconds. He was horrified, scandalized, that we could sit there and laugh at this fact. After this morning lecture period by Comrade Sun, then we broke for 2 hours at midday. From 12 till 2 o'clock we were free to sit in our rooms, pace up and down, taking the air in the compound, and if we wished, to drink boiled water. There was no midday meal in the prison camp, by the way, but boiled water was available from the kitchens. At 2 o'clock the bell again summoned us to the lecture room, and there we still for. We might have Comrade Sun again, or Comrade Wong, or possibly, perhaps once every 3 weeks, Comrade Ding himself. The commander of the camp, Old Snake Eyes, would appear personally, and he would talk to us for an hour and a half, possibly more, in high-pitched Chinese about the world political situation, about how the peace talks are going at Panmunjom, about how the British and American imperialists were striving to extend the Korean War into a third world war, and all the rest of it. And then that would be translated to us by Comrade Wong, who was a very smart young chap, a clever young man, about 23, with a brilliant command of English. Comrade Wong would then translate that to us in about 15 minutes. Or, if Commander Ding wasn't talking, then there might be communal study for the whole camp, when some massive volume like Marx's Das Kapital or William Z. Foster's Outline History of the Americas might be produced. And one of the prisoners, preferably a senior rank, to humiliate him in the presence of the younger officers, would be asked to stand up and forced to read from this book. Sometimes Sun would interrupt him, and he'd point to preferably a colonel or a major and say, "Jones or Robinson, stand up and tell the group what has been the main subject of the chapter we have just read." As I say, it was like living in some absurd and nightmarish indoctrination school, in which the Chinese made every attempt to pour scorn on our way of life, on all that we hold dear, and in the course of which attempts were made to humiliate personally the senior ranks present. That went on till about 4. Then there was the break for the second and last meal of the day. Menu was for breakfast, and then on to the parade ground at 5 o'clock for second roll call. Then there was a gap of about 40 minutes, and then the final period of communist indoctrination for the day. This took the form of our returning to our squad rooms and being issued with questionnaires, sheets of paper in which we had to write our correct number and name and answer in writing with pencils the Chinese provided us with certain leading questions. Now here is the type of question that a communist will ask you. State why the triumph of world socialism is inevitable. State why the Soviet Union heads the world peace camp. Give Lenin's 5 contradictions within capitalism. State who is the unjust aggressor in Korea and give reasons. Now, gentlemen, it doesn't take very much imagination to see the type of answer that our friends wanted to these questions. And woe betide the person who was brave enough to give a hostile answer. You see the complete dogmatic certainty of communism that it is absolutely right in its interpretations of all human events is such that any answer which is different from the answer the party lays down is a hostile answer, and the giver of it may rightly be punished. As I say, if it's ever your misfortune to live in a communist camp and undergo indoctrination, you will discover that very quickly. There's only one answer, and any other answer is a hostile answer, which must be repressed. That session went on until about 7:30, 7:45 in the evening, and then lights out and bed, until we worked round to 6:30 the next morning. If it was not a political questionnaire of the type I've just indicated, it might be a personal questionnaire on these lines. And this may strike you as strange, gentlemen. Give your wife's religious denomination and her political affiliation. What was your paternal grandfather's occupation? How much money has your father got in the bank? Do you own a car, and if so, what make? What church do you belong to? What is the name of the pastor or the parish priest? Give the names of 3 friends who've served with you in your armed forces. Strange questions indeed. And to what bizarre pattern they all added up in the files in Peking, we shall probably never know. I remember one American officer with rather typical American humor, on being asked to give the name of an intimate friend, wrote down Joe the Grinder. And the Chinese accepted that. Very strange. As long as you write something down, the Western prisoner, always remember this, the Western prisoner always has an advantage over his captors, in the sense of his captors, if they are Oriental captors, in the sense that he can always play the language difficulty side to his own advantage. He knows that the Chinese, although they may understand a lot of English, there are inevitable limitations. When you are a prisoner of war of any captor, this would be whether your captor was German or Italian even, although it may seem on first sight that all the advantage is with the power which has captured you, nevertheless, the prisoner himself, or rather I should say a group of prisoners, have certain strong advantages on their side too, which can be played as opportunity offers. Well now, I want to stress 3 things now, gentlemen, which it will be your duty to carry out if ever you fell into the hands of communist captors. And let us face this quite realistically. If you do become prisoners of war, it will certainly be prisoners of war of the communists. And we probably don't visualize an all-out, quickly finished global war. God forbid any kind of war. But we can visualize the outbreak in some part of the world of a comparatively small, localized conflict, such as the Korean one was. And it's in relation to a conflict of that type, gentlemen, that the possibility arises that you might become prisoners of war. Now, there are 3 great functions which any prisoner of war has to fulfill, and this is particularly so in the hands of a communist power. He must always keep before him the possibility that he can escape, and he must bend all his efforts personally and in secret escape groups within the compound towards that end. The possibility of escape. He must never allow himself to think that he could not escape. He must always be thinking privately about the possibility of escape. Secondly, he must have strongly developed, and my goodness, he needs to have this strongly developed in the hands of communist captors, he must have strongly developed the will to survive. I can tell you of a case of a young American lad completely overwhelmed by the experience and degradation of falling into the hands of the Chinese, when conditions were really bad in the first few months of the captivity, when men were living in conditions infested with filth and lice and were dying at the rate of a dozen a week. I can tell you a case of a young American lad who'd given up the will to live. Admittedly, he had dysentery, but other men managed to fight that off in some way or another, and he'd given up the desire to live. The chaplain spoke to him. The doctor, one of the American doctors who were a prisoner of war, came in and spoke firmly and confidently to him. You must hang on, lad. You can get better. Other men have done it. You can do it. I shall never forget how that boy turned to the doctor and said in a complaining, whimpering sort of voice, "Ah, Doc, you can't make me go on living if I don't want to." And he turned to the wall, and during the night he just quietly died. He gave up the will to live. And as a prisoner, as a chaplain who's been a prisoner of war, I have seen men literally give up this will to survive. It is often easier, gentlemen, to die than it is to live on and hope for a better day. But your motto must be the old Latin one: while I breathe, I live. I hope. While I breathe, I hope rather. While I breathe, I hope. Dum spiro, spero. While I breathe, I hope. The will to survive, that is absolutely vital to the prisoner of war, and especially to the prisoner of war in communist hands. And the third thing you must keep before you is your duty to harass your captors in every possible way, on every type of occasion. I will repeat those, and I'm going to change the order in the second time over. First of all, I'll say the will to survive. First of all, the will to survive, the grip on life, the grip on the things you hold dear, and I would say the grip on your faith in Jesus Christ himself. The will to survive, the possibility of escape, which you must never let go from your mind and your efforts, and thirdly, the duty to harass your captors, both mentally and, if possible, physically. I've said something about the will to survive. That's pretty obvious. I'd like to say something about escape. I myself did not attempt to escape because, being the only chaplain left in the camp ultimately, I felt it was my duty to stay there even down to the last half dozen men. Now, that's the chaplain's function, that he should stay because the men need him in the camp. He can give things that other men are not able to give. But the average prisoner, he must have this desire to escape. Many escape attempts were made in Korea, but they all failed because of the difficulty of the terrain and because of the outstanding immediate difference that one sees between the European type of face and the Asiatic, Korean or Chinese face. Comparatively easy to escape as a prisoner in Germany. One could, and sometimes men did, mingle with the crowd. But you can't do that in a country like Korea. The facial characteristics are so outstandingly different, and you're spotted immediately. But the immense difficulties which confronted men trying to escape never did deter men from making the attempt, and that's a wonderful thing to remember. Many American and British prisoners were always trying to escape, did get out of the compound, perhaps might be at large for 8 or 10 days, and were then brought back for punishment. But it's a great thing to remember that they never gave up the possibility of escape, and little escape groups and committees were always secretly planning away and gathering things together secretly and concealing them, which would be useful when an escape breakout was made. The question of harassing captures. I want to give you some impression of how we manage to harass our captors. I'm going to give you some examples of mental, or you might call it spiritual, harassment. And I would repeat what I said a few minutes ago. Don't forget that if you are a prisoner of war, it may seem on first sight that all the advantages are with your captors, but when you look into the matter a little closely, you see that the prisoners themselves also have important cards that they can play, and which they must play. Well, some examples of mental evasion or mental harassment of our communist captors who are doing their best to indoctrinate us and convert us to their point of view. There was one glorious week in the prisoner of war camp, when we organized a crazy week, when men did the most absurd things to make the Chinese wonder what was going on. For instance, we had a week when the Navy flyers and other flyers imagined that the camp parade ground was a landing ground for planes. And the exact drill was carried out. You got grown-up men, majors and colonels, zooming down the compound with outspread arms, and other men waving them in with their little bats and so on. The whole drill, such as you'd see being carried out on the deck of an aircraft carrier. The Chinese watched this astounded. What on earth was going on? It was a case of another man who was taken over for interrogation to headquarters, who insisted on driving all the way there on an imaginary motorbicycle with the appropriate noises and motions and everything. Chinese guards completely foxed. You see, it takes a lot, even for communist captors, to get so annoyed that they will drive a bayonet into you without thinking. I mean, there's a little more humanity in man than that. It takes a bit before you take that step, and that is a safety margin which you have as a prisoner of war. On other occasions, during that memorable week, one of several others, when the Chinese came to root us out, to go down onto the parade ground for roll call in the morning, they found several of the rooms completely deserted, emptied of men. There were the sleeping mats and the old blankets folded up neatly by each man's bed space, but all the prisoners had gone. They'd all gone out very early and hidden in the twilight, the morning twilight, behind the latrines. Of course, the consternation that broke out, 2 rooms entirely emptied of prisoners. Other guards went into rooms further down the corridor and found men sitting solemnly playing bridge without any cards at all by candlelight, just sitting there dealing out the cards. Chinese guards stood completely mystified watching this. Now their reaction is, what's the next step? Obviously we're being made fools of. What is the next step for us? How do we save face? And of course, as you know, with the Orientals, this desire to save face is a very prominent factor in their psychological makeup. On another occasion, after Chinese roll call in the morning had been dismissed, all the prisoners remained in the center of the compound in a vast huddle, rather like some gigantic rugby scrum, all heads down, all apparently looking at some interesting object in the center of the compound, which the Chinese couldn't see. Well, the guards and the interpreters and the Chinese squad leaders, they stood on the bund on which the schoolhouse was built, looking down at this and wondering what was going on. Why didn't the prisoners come in? We still remained there in dead silence, 3 minutes, nearly 5 minutes. The Chinese were wondering what to do, what are they up to? At last, natural curiosity overcame a couple of the instructors, and accompanied by armed guards, they walked down to the group. As they reached the outskirts of this vast huddle, word was given, we just solemnly broke up and walked away. And of course there was nothing there at all. It's a simple, childish thing, but that's the sort of harassment which is of immense value. It unsettles your captors for the whole of that day. They're wondering what are they going to do next? And in the second place, it opens a safety valve for laughter among the prisoners. You don't laugh very much as a prisoner of war, and any opportunity like that is a great morale raiser. Some more examples. I was telling you about this group reading which the Chinese forced upon us. There were several American officers who were adepts at reading quickly and slipping in all sorts of unlawful comment between sentences. This sort of thing. And so when we look at the economic construction of the United States, we are very much aware of the working out of the principles which were first laid down by Marx, Engels, and later by Lenin, Amos and Andy, Stalin, and so on. That sort of thing which was able to be slipped in without the Chinese really knowing what was going on. Now there were some men who became experts at slipping in things like that. Again, one of the great features of life with the communists is the self-criticism. You may not have heard the phrase before, but if you do a thing which the Communist Party considers is wrong, whether you're a member of the party or a prisoner of war, you are brought before the group and forced to make your self-criticism. This usually takes place after you've been in solitary for about 10 days, and a certain amount of pressure has been put upon you. And your self-criticism is made according to a definite stereotyped form, which the Chinese and other communists have worked out. Well, the Chinese on one occasion issued us all with little cheap green notebooks and pencils for us to take notes during the indoctrination sessions. I don't need to tell you, gentlemen, that these notebooks were often misused and diverted to other purposes among the prisoners. Well, the Chinese got fed up with this, and they hauled out several senior ranks who were accused of misusing their notebooks. I never forget the occasion when one American major was brought back into the compound after 10 days solitary and forced to read out his written self-criticism of what he'd done with his book. And this is how it went. He gave his military number. James P. Robinson, we'll say his name is, Major, United States Army. The Chinese People's Volunteers have given me the opportunity during these past 10 days to reflect on my bad attitude in the past and to discover where my faults lie. I now make my self-criticism humbly and sincerely, and accuse myself that I have misused my little green notebook, so kindly given to me by the Chinese People's Volunteer Forces in Korea, that I might take notes during the study periods. Instead of using it in this way, I accuse myself that I have misused it in the following ways. I have used it for writing out menus. I have used it for compiling bridge scores. I have used it for latrine paper. I have used it for rolling cigarettes with Korean leaf tobacco. And finally, I confess that I have used it for doodling. An absolute masterpiece. The Chinese were satisfied. We sat there trying not to laugh, but there it was, they were satisfied. The prisoner had made his confession, accused himself, made a self-criticism, and he was dismissed, sent back to the compound, and no doubt his criticism paper was put in his file. The Chinese kept dossiers and files, of course, on every individual person in the camp. On another occasion, while we were waiting on one wintry afternoon for Ding to come and address us, we all began to chant very slowly and then louder and louder, "Why are we waiting? Why are we waiting?" And this great volume of sound, about 300 lusty British and American voices. Well, of course, the Chinese, just like a bomb dropping among ants, they were flying hither and thither. What's the next step? You could obviously see them saying, what do we do? Do we fire on them or what? And eventually Ding appeared. Of course, the usual dignity of his entrance was marred by the fact that he had to wait for a good 5 minutes outside the lecture room while the prisoners were somehow quietened down by the Chinese, and we eventually stopped. But of course, the poor chap coming in to give a solemn talk after 10 minutes of that, he's in a very difficult position. What's he going to do? Should he give up the attempt to address the prisoners this afternoon and retire with complete loss of face back to his quarters outside the compound, or should he come in and face it and stick it out? Well, he came in and faced it and stuck it out. But obviously, he was at a tremendous disadvantage. At the end of that session, we all filed up, and spontaneously we formed an enormous swaying conga. And there you saw the glorious spectacle of 300 men, all in the conga formation, weaving down the steps and round like a great big snake right round the compound, singing some wild South African Boy Scout song, which goes like this, something like this, Heidige Zumba, 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 Heidige Zumba, Zumba. There was Ding standing outside the compound with his interpreters, looking back with astonishment at this mad scene, and we kept that up for about 10 minutes. And in the end, the interpreters came and told us that unless we stopped, then 3 senior officers would be taken away and severely punished. And the threat of that, we gave up and went into our billets. Well, now, those are examples, gentlemen, of harassment of your captors. Very childish, I know. You may think, what on earth good can that do? But when you're a prisoner of war, it is that sort of thing which is of immense value, incalculable value. The only grim recollection in connection with that is this, that the Chinese punished the compound as a whole, in the end, by picking on a small group of the senior officers and putting them through very hard punishment and letting us know that these men were being made scapegoats of. And that's a very difficult thing to make up your mind about. Shall you give up these attempts in order to spare certain leading people being punished, or should you carry on with them despite that? Probably the general decision is that you should continue to carry on with such activities from time to time, although you know in advance, you've counted the cost, that certain men may be picked out for punishment on your behalf. I want to give you some impression, as we draw to a close of this talk this morning, of the methods of punishment which the Chinese used. Why should they punish their prisoners? They punished their prisoners for 2 things, 3 things rather, when I come to think of it, because they punished people for trying to escape, which was a crime. It was a crime to try and return from the camp of the peace-loving peoples of the world back to the reactionary camp of the warmongers. The fact that you tried to escape proved to the Chinese that you were hostile, you see. That was why they were really angry, in spite of all our wonderful teaching and all the great things that we have shown you. You still want to go back to the warmongers, do you? Well, we'll show you. So there was punishment for escape. Now that took the form of the prisoners being marched back, roped together from the point they'd actually escaped to, which was often quite a weary march, on the absolute minimum scale of rations, and then put into solitary confinement in the most foul and wretched holes for about 2 or 3 months, pending their trial. The Chinese always loved that period of delay. Then your trial, your people's trial, came up, and you were accused of trying to escape, of trying to return to the camp of the warmongers, and then your sentence was pronounced. But that 3 months you'd spent didn't count at all. You might get 4 months solitary confinement. You'd done 3 of them, but you stopped from the day your sentence was given. And the Chinese were experts at delaying tactics. 6 weeks before your sentence was pronounced just didn't count. You were also punished for having a hostile attitude, as I've said before, or giving the wrong sort of provocative answer to Chinese questions. You could be punished by solitary confinement in the middle of that terrible winter weather, which meant that you would have to sit for about 10 days in a windowless, unheated jail on the road outside the compound with 1 blanket and 2 meals a day, until you began to realize that in your toes and fingers were the first signs of frostbite. The Chinese never actually would lay a hand upon you. They just put you in solitary confinement for disciplinary purposes, and they let the cold do the rest. There are very few men who, after 10 days of that, are not prepared to write something or sign something. Other types of punishment known to me, which were practiced by the Chinese, were the tying of prisoners up with their hands behind their backs, forced up behind their backs, so that they were drawn up onto their toes, and being kept in that position for periods of 24 to 36 hours. Being fed by the guards while they were still hanging there, until at last they are prepared to sign something or write something or say something. Other types of punishment were the keeping of the prisoners in tiny cells like little rabbit hutches. There were men who went through 2 months of living in the boxes, what they call the boxes, little huts in which you could just about lie down but couldn't sit upright and couldn't stretch out completely. You were lying all the time in those huts. Now, there were men who went through 2 months of that because they wouldn't join in communist propaganda against their own countries or United Nations. They wouldn't make broadcasts. They wouldn't sign statements. They wouldn't give away escape troops and so on. There was a tremendous amount of sheer dogged heroism shown by all ranks in our camps in Korea. I regret to have to say there was also an amount of sheer betrayal and cowardice and meanness and opportunism that went on among our prisoners in the hands of the communists. I haven't got time this morning to go any further into those questions. I am not going to speak on this occasion, gentlemen, for more than another 3 to 5 minutes. For one thing, I have to get a plane this morning back to my battalion in North Germany, and secondly, there is the grave danger that if we go on too long, you might begin to get bored. Very few human beings can stand more than an hour's talk at any one time. There's a lot more that I want to say and that I could say, and normally when I give these talks, they're divided into 2 parts. I speak for an hour or just over, then there's a coffee break of half an hour, then I continue with the second half. But this morning, I must try and pack it all into this one talk. I would like to close with trying to indicate to you the special role of religious belief for a prisoner in the hands of a communist power. You probably have absolutely no illusions as to the absolute irreconcilability of the Christian faith and the communist faith. Communism, gentlemen, is a religion. It's a complete system of thought and belief worked out. It is completely and absolutely atheistic, completely and utterly opposed to the church as a corporate organization working in human society. At the moment, as you know, in Soviet countries, the church is enjoying an uneasy kind of toleration. But the whole stress in a communist country is that religion is something which is all right for the old fogies who've been brought up for it, but we want it to quietly die now. The young people will be brought up in the schools to know that there is absolutely nothing in it, that there is no God, that the teachings of Christ and the Bible are a lot of outworn nonsense which the capitalists have been using over the past ages for their own advantages. So you must have the clear idea that Christianity and communism are absolutely irreconcilable. It's just like to think that Christianity and communism can really coexist is just like trying to persuade yourself that a blob of ice cream will retain its identity as ice cream in front of an open furnace. It will not. So when you fall, if you were to fall into the hands of a communist power, you will find then that your religious faith, or gentlemen, your lack of it, will show itself very clearly. And as I looked round that prison compound, and I saw men of many different backgrounds, many different traditions, many different types of upbringing, I saw very clearly in a short time that those men who had a simple, sincere Christian faith in God and in Christ were much better off than those who had either given up religious practice or didn't know what they believed, hadn't said their prayers, hadn't opened their Bibles, hadn't been to church for a long time. Many of that latter group, I'm glad to say, came to me as chaplain in the prison camp and said, "Chaplain, what's it all about? Sit down and tell us something. We haven't been to church or said prayers for years. But now, in this prison camp and faced with all this, I'd like to know something more about it." So I would say that in a communist prison of war camp of all places, there is a situation where your religious faith is of immense value. And in fact, it is the only thing that could give any purpose to your life in a communist prison camp, and it is the only thing which would really give you any reason for resisting and even suffering in the hands of your captors. In the Chinese prison camp, I was one of 4 chaplains, 1 Roman Catholic, 2 American Protestant chaplains, and myself, Church of England. Those 3 other chaplains were all dead from disease and their privations before autumn 1951. And so for the remaining 2 years, I was the only chaplain in that prison camp. And I had to carry on a struggle of increasing intensity with the Chinese to hang on to any kind of public organized religious observance. The Chinese granted at first a kind of grudging toleration, but after a time they began to wish to withdraw this, or at least to narrow it down to very, very narrow confines indeed. I can't go into that this morning in the last minute or 2 left with me. That would be a separate talk. But one thing has become crystal clear to me, and it is this: that in the conditions of communist captivity, in which you may expect to meet not only tremendous mental and spiritual pressures, you will meet those, but also conditions of life which are humiliating, degrading, and filthy. In those conditions, there is one thing, one great thing, that can ennoble men, can dignify them even in those surroundings, can give them courage and hope, and give them the resourcefulness to hang on to all that they know in their heart and conscience is true and good. And that one thing is the religion of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Thank you for listening to me so graciously for this 1 hour. I hope perhaps on another occasion, gentlemen, I may be able to extend and amplify some of the things that I have had to say rather quickly and briefly this morning.